Well, good evening, everybody. It's great to see so many people attending the Northeast of Scotland branch this evening. Just to let you know, my name's Andy McNair. I'm the chair for the Northeast of Scotland branch, and we've got a great presentation that's going to be put on this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to drop straight into there and probably have a little conversation with everybody towards the end of everything. So this evening, we are hosting a presentation based around the management of confined space. It's being hosted by Mines Rescue Service, and we did originally have the operations, is he the operations manager or operations director?
Operations director now.
Operations director. So sadly, he's just returned from holiday and he's been diagnosed with COVID. So that's his little con socks. Andy Watson, who's the deputy manager for Mines Rescue Service, has gladly jumped in to save the day and support us. So many thanks for that, Andy.
Okay.
Mines Rescue Service, for anybody who doesn't know, it is pretty much what they say. It's a long-established organization. They specialized in not only just on the training side of things, but also rescue services as well, whether that be from working at height or working in confined spaces. And there's certain training courses from confined space access or an entry to the management of confined space, working at height training, health and safety training, fire training. You're involved in a vast array of things there. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Andy. Andy Watson, as said, is a deputy manager for Mines Rescue Service. Been there for 14 years and been in the managerial position for just over 2 years. So if you've been there for 14 years, I'd imagine you've been through all the various steps as well, from probably doing the rescue aspects to the training side of things as well. Also in charge of doing the quality assurance and ensuring the best standards of quality and compliance are being met within the organisation. So without further ado, Andy, I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much.
We're on the screen sharing.
Just while you're doing that, can I just make sure as well that everybody is got their microphones on mute, so it just doesn't interrupt the speaker. If you do have any questions as we go through, please do raise it in the chat function to the sides, and we'll certainly try and pick them up. If not during the presentation, we'll certainly pick them up towards the end. Okay, so thank you very much and enjoy.
Thank you. So, as you can see from the first slide here, it's got confined spaces overview. Now, I know the subject we're going to focus on is mainly on the management side of confined spaces and how people in supervisory positions, if you like, almost control the work associated with confined spaces. I do kind of need to stress that we've got about an hour here to kind of go through this. So it really is a focus on an overview. I mean, to put that into perspective, to train people to the City and Guild standards for confined spaces is now a 5-day course. So we just need to stress that, although we'll be open to questions and things like that at the end, it's a skim as opposed to a deep dive, if you like. So just to follow on the kind of introduction to myself, as Andy had said, I am the deputy manager for MRS Training and Rescue, as we are now known. That is a trading name of the Mines Rescue Service. We've been in existence for over 100 years, and although mine related historically, what we do now is open to all industries. We were in a position, if you like, where we could take an element of innovation and creativity over the years, whether intentional or not, and apply our services to all industries. I mean, to put it into a nutshell, chances are if you've got guys working in confined spaces and you require a rescue team, chances are you will either have an MRS rescue team, or you will have an organisation that was most likely trained by MRS Training and Rescue. So we would certainly say that confined space work in the modern take on it, if you like, is really our bread and butter. And we've been able to adapt into kind of many other industries and sectors based on that. So first of all, if we just have a wee chat about confined spaces themselves, and a little bit of a history lesson here, if you like. Even now, there are hundreds of accidents every single year associated with confined spaces. Not necessarily all of them are people who are actually working in them, but in and around them, if you like. Now, one of the things that we would say about that is because of the high hazard nature of confined spaces, it's not uncommon that these would result in major lost time incidents or accidents. And this also reflects when we speak about the competence of people who work in and around those environments, and we'll have a chat about competence a little later on. But the statistics are quite scary when you see that 50% of fatalities from confined spaces, from a general viewpoint, are would-be rescuers. People who weren't necessarily trained or competent or have the necessary equipment to facilitate a rescue, and ultimately suffered the same or worse fate than the people that they were trying to help. Now, if you put all that together, the Health and Safety Executive introduced the confined space regulations. Came about in 1997. Now, if you look at this kind of on a spectrum, if you like, and compare it to another hazard that has a set of regulations associated with it. So if we're using this as a spectrum, let's imagine on one end of that spectrum, you've got the amount of people who are affected by that hazard. And at the other end of that spectrum, you've kind of got the severity of it when it goes wrong, right? So if you compare the confined space regulations to the manual handling regulations, right? Manual handling regulations kind of sits at this end of the spectrum, because I think it's fairly safe to say that from a likelihood standpoint, not very many people die as a result of manual handling related injuries, all right? The severity is quite low, okay? But because manual handling injuries can literally affect everybody at work, doesn't matter whether you're working in high hazard industry or low hazard industries, manual handling is an issue. So you could argue that the manual handling regulations exist, not because of how severe it is, but because of the amount of people that are affected by it, all right? Now, if you compare that to the confined space regulations who sit on the other side of that, general statistics suggest that around about 5 to 10% of the UK's workforce on a day-to-day basis is involved in confined space work, all right? Now, not talking about injuries, but talking about fatalities. Even now in the UK, we average around about 10 to 12 fatalities a year in confined spaces, okay? Now, based on some engineering, construction and industry training boards standards, they say around about 30 to 40% of the UK's workforce is involved in construction work. Now, based on some recent statistics from then, they averaged around about 40 fatalities in the construction industry, all right? So if you do the very simple maths, if confined space work has somewhere between 5 and 10% of the UK's workforce, and we're still averaging around about 10 to 12 fatalities a year, compared to the construction industry, which has a massive workforce, and they're averaging around about 35 to 40 fatalities a year, those simple maths suggest that confined space work is dangerous. And if people are getting injured in those environments, it tends not to be a sore back for 5 to 7 days or cut fingers. We're talking about major accidents, major fatalities and lost time injuries, all right? So if manual handling sits at this end, confined spaces sit at this end of that spectrum, and it's all about how severe it is when it goes wrong, all right? So based on all that information, the Health and Safety Executive, introduced the Confined Space Regulations 1997. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to focus on the headline acts within those regulations. There are 9 pieces of legislation within the Confined Space Regs. For the purposes of this conversation, we'll have a chat about Regulation 1, Regulation 4, and Regulation 5. They're the headline acts, if you want to put it that way. Regulation 1 basically helps us define what a confined space is. All right. Now, by definition, under the regulations, that is what it states. A confined space means any place, including any chamber, tank, vat, silo, pit, trench, pipe, sewer, flue, well, or other similar place in which, by virtue of its enclosed nature, there arises a reasonably foreseeable specified risk. Right? Now, if we kind of break that statement down, if you like, right? Confined space means any place. So that following list from here to here, if you like, that's not an exclusive or exhaustive list. That's just some common examples of environments that might fall into the category of a confined space, right? That's why it kind of stays or similar place, and then it breaks it down into this kind of definition, if you like. By virtue of its enclosed nature, there has to be a reasonably foreseeable specified risk, right? Think of those two phrases as your kind of key elements here, right? And a real simple way to break that down is a method that we refer to as the confined space triangle. It works pretty similar to the fire triangle, which is fairly standard throughout most, fire-related publications and that type of stuff. Fire triangle basically dictates that for a fire to start, you need all 3 elements: heat, fuel, and oxygen. This is a very similar principle with confined spaces. Okay, you need the 3 elements for you to have a confined space, right? 2 of them are quite clearly mentioned in the description there, right? You have to have an element of enclosure, all right? It does not need to be entirely enclosed. Okay, it can be, you get, using the example of pits, for example, pits tend not to have roofs, so they're not entirely enclosed. You could say the same about wells. They don't tend to have roofs. Also, in some industries that manufacture aggregates, for example, they might have places in their processing plant that contain grains, type 1, aggregates for creating cement and that type of stuff that don't have roofs and don't have a 4th wall. They're just 3 containers, if you like, right? So there has to be an element of enclosure, but it doesn't have to be entirely, okay? You also have to have what is known as a reasonably foreseeable specified risk, okay? Specified basically means that these risks that we're going to be having a chat about are actually named, they're actually specified in the confined space regulations, okay? And we'll touch on those in a wee minute or two. So there has to be an element of enclosure and 1 or more of those reasonably foreseeable specified risks, okay? Now, it's not uncommon if we were doing a full-blown training course and you were in the room with me, for example, you would open this up to the room to see what do you think the 3rd side of that triangle would be. And it's not uncommon, people would say things like access and egress, for example. Physical dimensions is often a common one. Now, although those 2 examples kind of play a part within whether it's a confined space or not, they're by no means the most important, all right? The 3rd side of that triangle is people, okay? And you've almost got to have a little bit of a mindset here, if you like, and how you imagine a confined space in your mind here, right? So for the purposes of this discussion, okay, let's imagine a clean water tank, And at the moment, it's a clean water tank and it's full right up to the brim with water, okay? So you could argue that at this point, it's a water tank, it's fully enclosed, it's got a small access point on the top, you've got that element of enclosure, it's full of water, so as you'll see in a wee minute or two, it's likely if someone was to climb in there while it's full of water, they could drown. So we've got a reasonably foreseeable specified risk. But at the moment, we're stood on the outside looking at that water tank. So what we don't have is the third side of the triangle, okay? So at the moment, as far as the law is concerned, it's not a confined space. It's a water tank and it's full of water and it's doing what water tanks do on a day-to-day basis, okay? But this is the mindset here where people have to kind of just think about this process. The second you're intending of putting somebody inside that water tank, all right, and exposing them to the hazards associated with being enclosed and being full of water, we've completed the third side of that triangle. So this is the mindset here that you need to consider that it is no longer a water tank. As far as the confined space regulations are concerned, it's now a confined space, all right? Once you've completed all three sides of the triangle, the confined space regulations essentially apply, okay? So there are 5 specified risks, all right? Now, given the nature of this audience, I don't think I need to elaborate on the differences in definitions of hazards and risks, okay? But it's important to remember that that says specified risks. It doesn't say specified hazards, okay? So we could argue that these regulations are more concerned on the likelihood that these risks are going to be present as opposed to the things that are likely to cause harm, the hazards, okay? Now they are obviously closely linked, but the regulations dictate or speak about the risks more so than the hazards. So how that looks in kind of practice, if we were wording it correctly, if you like, if it was reasonably foreseeable that somebody could have a serious injury arising from a fire or an explosion, so what we're saying here that it's quite likely that could catch fire or could blow up, and it's inside an element of enclosure and somebody is exposed to that, it's a confined space, right? If we're saying that it is reasonably foreseeable that someone could lose consciousness arising from an increase in body temperature plus that element of enclosure, then it's a confined space. Now, this point also often opens up some discussion. Normal body temperature for a healthy adult sits somewhere between 36 and 37 degrees, okay? Your core body temperature actually only needs to jump to the high 38s, 39 degrees for you to start to feel the ill effects of the heat. I mean, just for example, one of the first things our bodies do as we get hotter is our pores open up, we lose fluids, and also our bodies expand. And there has been some cases in the past where some guys have gone into work and perhaps boilers or furnaces, which have had some form of safe system applied to them, but because of the residual heat that's been left and the small access points normally associated with those spaces, there has actually been people who have climbed in, but because of the residual heat, have been unable to climb back out again, simply because their body has expanded, okay? If you add to that heat exhaustion and ultimately things like heat stroke, excess heat can actually become fatal relatively quickly, all right? Which then ultimately leads us to the fact that a decrease in body temperature isn't mentioned in the confined space regulations. Now, the cold is obviously dangerous, but your core body temperature needs to drop quite significantly for you to feel the ill effects of it. Whereas an increase, it only needs to jump that little bit, and it could ultimately lead to you not being able to safely get yourself out. Okay. We then have a loss of consciousness or asphyxiation arising from gas, fume, vapor, or a lack of oxygen. And what we're ultimately speaking about here is toxins and poisons in our atmosphere, essentially affecting our respiratory system. Again, if it is reasonably foreseeable that the atmosphere in that space can be compromised, plus the element of enclosure, is a confined space. We've then got drowning. If it is reasonably foreseeable that somebody could drown because of an increase in the level of liquid, plus the element of enclosure, it's a confined space. This often opens up a few discussion points as well, because some people often confuse it because they often think we're speaking about water, but we're not. The confined space regulations don't specify water, they specify liquid. So some people could argue that if they were going to go, this is the way that they would like to go, in a vat full of Johnny Walker, for example. But somebody working in a distillery, and if they fell inside one of the stills or vats, they could drown just as easy in that as they could falling into a clean water tank or a swimming pool. But then this opens up the other points that you need to consider what you might think as being secondary hazards or secondary risks. So using myself as an example here, I don't do particularly well with a nip of Johnny Walker. And I would say at very least my ability to make safety conscious decisions can be impaired very quickly on a nip of whiskey. So if you consider that, having fell into it and I've maybe taken a few mouthfuls in it as I'm flailing about in it, if you like, you could easily argue that my ability to make decisions is going to be impaired very quickly, given the fact that it's also making me pretty unwell. And if you also consider that some of that liquid, it may not have gone through its full distilling process yet, and it might also be causing me skin irritations, burns, that type of things. If you relate that to, for example, companies who manufacture cleaning products, before they're individually bottled in 500 ml or litre bottles, they will have vats and silos of that stuff at their processing plants. And people, if they can fall into it, could do themselves some serious damage. So it's not just considering the fact that people can drown, you also have to consider those secondary hazards associated with liquids, chemicals, that type of stuff. Last one there is asphyxiation, or how this is worded within the confined space regs. It actually says asphyxiation or entrapment arising from a free-flowing solid. So a free-flowing solid is things like grains, coal, ash, lime, earth, aggregates, that type of stuff, all right? Not only could somebody very similar to be drowning, if they're completely engulfed in the stuff above their headline and can't access the oxygen in the atmosphere, then essentially they'll suffocate. But there has been cases where people have asphyxiated simply because that grain has engulfed them up to chest height. Because of the weight associated with grains, coal, earth, that type of stuff, it can literally stop people's diaphragms from expanding and stopping their lungs from essentially pumping the air in, if you like. So although their respiratory organs, if you like, their nose and their mouth are still uncovered and on display, the actual lungs, because of the weight, are unable to draw the air in. And you also have to consider that because of the weight of that, every bone in their body could be broken by the weight of these aggregates and grains and that type of stuff. It's often one of those ones, particularly from the old coal mining days, if you like, or the rescue side of it, if you like. It was always a bit of a painstaking process trying to free somebody who'd been entrapped by an inrush of coal, because essentially that could be holding them together. And it had to be very slow and careful process on how they freed them from that, given that situation, right? So those are your specified risks. As we said, they are written in the confined space regulations. So by law, if you have one or more of those that are present, along with that element of enclosure, and you are exposing someone to the hazard associated with it, then the confined space regulations apply. All right. One of the things that often pops up when we're having these conversations with groups is these hazards that are associated with these risks. They might not necessarily be indigenous to the space. They might not be present at this particular moment, but because of the work scope that is happening in that environment, you might be importing something into that space that creates these specified risks. An example of that could be going into an enclosed space, not a confined space, but an enclosed space, and using cleaning chemicals to clean it. Or, somebody who's going to do hot work in an enclosed environment. There's not normally a specified risk present, but the introduction of those welding gases, the increase in the likelihood that a fire or explosion might occur, you've now created a confined space. Okay, so it is important to remember from a management standpoint that you have to look at the bigger picture. There are some confined spaces out there that, by definition, at the moment, aren't confined spaces by law, but because of the work that might happen in them, perhaps on a routine basis, they might become confined spaces. But then the reverse happens. As soon as those, for example, hot work gases or cleaning chemicals are then removed from that enclosed environment, it may then cease to be a confined space. All right. So there's a potential life cycle to some of these environments. So what do we need to do, or what do we have to do? This area here focuses on Regulation 4 of the Confined Space Regulations. A simple way of wording it is, how do we work in these environments? And Reg 4 is actually split into kind of two, for want of a better word. Reg 4 Part 1 is quite explicit. No person shall enter a confined space to carry out work for any purpose unless it is not reasonably practicable to achieve that purpose without such entry. Avoid the entry if possible. To think of that another way, you actually don't get any more low risk than not being in it in the first place. And if we can create a safe system of work that actually removes the need to go into that space, then essentially what the regulations are telling us here, that is how we do it. Okay. Now, if you maybe go back over the last 20 years or so, if you use the example of vessel cleaning or tank cleaning, it's not uncommon now that, industrial cleaning contractors will bring in big HIAB systems, big hoovers essentially, and they'll have the big tankers, big pumping system, or a line of thick hose, and it goes, and everything that's inside it just gets pumped out. Okay. Now, a successful attempt at that will quite easily pump everything out. But another way of looking at that, which we'll touch on more in a wee second, is if that tanker manages to pump out 95% of the sludge that was in that tank, for example, then what you've done there is you've removed 95% of the hazard, or one of the hazards, which ultimately leads to you've potentially removed 95% of the time that somebody's having to spend in there. Okay. But if we can remove the need to enter, that's the way we should do it. I mean, another more modern example of this, and this is something that MRS are currently looking at the moment, is the use of drones for doing inspection work. If you can remove the need to actually put an inspector or a surveyor into a confined space to carry out, basic visual inspections, then the technology there, which is becoming more accessible and cheaper all the time, then again, there's another avenue that we can look at as technology moves forward to reduce the need for people to have to go into these environments, okay? And I can't stress it enough. It doesn't say no person so far as reasonably practicable. It says no person shall enter, okay? So if we can figure out a way to avoid the entry, that is how we must do it, okay? However, we also have to be sensible. We don't quite live in a world yet where we have robots to the standard that can go in and actually carry out, for example, repair work. If something needs to be welded to something else, or if something needs to be unbolted and removed, chances are somebody's going to have to go in there and do that. So you could consider part 2 of regulation 4 to be the area, the element of common sense, if you like, okay? If it is not reasonably practicable to avoid the entry, okay, then if somebody has to go in, then it must be done in line with a safe system of work, okay? Now again, given my audience, I don't think I necessarily need to go down into the ins and outs of what makes a safe system of work, but it is basically the big picture, okay? If you've got an organization that doesn't have a positive culture for safety, then chances are the safe systems of work that they use on a day-to-day basis for routine tasks will probably be full of holes, okay? Whereas if you've got an organization that does have a positive culture for safety and takes it seriously, then chances are all your day-to-day safe systems of work for routine tasks, etc., will generally be quite good, okay? So some of the key elements associated with a safe system of work for confined spaces. Risk assessment. Again, judging by my audience here, a risk assessment is almost the cornerstone of any safe system of work. We could argue that you could have what you might consider to be the finest suite of documents and procedures you've ever seen in your life that look amazing and headed notepaper and all that jazz. But essentially, if they're not based on a risk assessment, then they're probably not really worth the paper they are printed on, okay? So a risk assessment is the cornerstone to a safe system of work associated with confined spaces, right? What are the hazards? What are likely to do the harm? Who is likely to be affected by them? How can we control them? And how can we bring them down to that residual level that makes it reasonably practicable, okay? Then another good example of a safe system of work for confined spaces is the translation of that risk assessment into a safe methodology of actually doing the work, okay? What does that look like in practice, okay? Then the next element, which we'll have a chat about in more detail in a little minute or two, are those rescue arrangements. That's regulation 5 of the confined space regulations. And again, it's an absolute, right? And we'll touch more on that in a wee minute. But for the purposes of this section, you can't put anybody into a confined space if you've not thought about how they're going to get back out again, okay? And we'll touch more on that in a wee minute or two. You've then got things like controlling entry, authorizing entry using a permit to enter. And most organizations that are associated with health and safety related standards, if anybody was to give an example of what is a common task associated with the need for a permit to work, then a permit to enter a confined space is usually one of them, okay? You then have to consider isolations, whether mechanical or electrical, to kind of stop or control hazards from getting access to the environment that people are working in. You need to have competent people. Again, competency is that mixed bag of, if you like, of skill, knowledge, attitude, training, and experience. And all of those come together, and you know, some more than others, but ultimately people need to understand the environments that they're going to be working in. They need to understand how to use the equipment that they're going to be using. We often give this example on training courses where if you look at this picture here with the escape set, if you've never seen one of those before and never had the opportunity to experience what it feels like on your head, what the alarm system sounds like when you're running out of air and how to don it correctly, the last thing you actually want to be doing is putting one of them on your head for the first time in an emergency situation. And that's why the term competent people and training courses like a medium risk to high risk confined space course exist, is to give people the hands-on experience of using that equipment before they actually have to do it for real. You also have to consider how people are going to communicate in these environments. Obviously, people being able to see and speak to each other are your preferred methods. The most simplest routes are often the best. But unfortunately, given the nature of confined spaces, you actually sometimes have to think outside the box on how people are going to communicate. I mean, something like, for example, radios don't work particularly well when one radio is on the surface and one radio is underground. The Faraday effect, if you like, can come into play there. If those radio waves have to bounce off a bunch of rock and muck, then it's going to decrease or remove the signal. So sometimes, for example, you have to consider if putting a hardwired system in because it's just a temporary job isn't really that practical, then sometimes people have to come up with more novel ways of being able to communicate. Things like air horns and whistles are commonly used with codes of signals. But the reason why that's mentioned in this safe system of work is if you're using a non-verbal means of communicating, then people need to understand what those signals mean. If somebody was to say to you, give me a couple of blasts on the air horn, let me know you're okay. Or if I give you a long blast on the air horn that lasts for an excess of 10 seconds, that means I want you to come out. But then if you've got guys working that in space and they all of a sudden hear 3 or 4 short blasts on the air horn and it wasn't established what that means at the start, then you've not got an effective means of communicating. So it's important that as part of the safe system of work. Monitoring the atmosphere, basically making sure people have got air to breathe in these environments. It could mean purging, it could mean cleaning, it could mean setting up potentially complex ventilation systems that draw fresh air in, but also remove any hostiles from the atmosphere. PPE, particularly important, and there isn't, a kind of generic list of PPE that's associated with confined spaces. If you looked at the list of the specified risks, all of those, as just an example, could potentially need their own specific sets of PPE and RPE to give people that air of protection, if you like. You have to consider how people are going to get in and get out. Now, it's not a defining feature, but it is a common feature, if you like, that confined spaces by their very nature aren't easy to get in. Now, we could argue that that is a good thing, because if they were easy to get in, then unauthorized access might be a little bit more common. But at the same time, how people get in needs to be considered. And if you use this picture down here as an example, the use of access equipment, harnesses and tripods and winches, anchor points, all has to be considered. Not all of them have staircases and ladders to get into them. Also, on that note, again, not a defining feature, but a common one, is they tend not to be well lit. They're not generally for human occupation on a regular basis. So people tend not to, at the manufacturing or design stage, think about lighting them. So again, that needs to be part of your safe system of work. And on top of that, all your equipment, along with the people who need to be competent and have some element of training to be able to prove competence, if you like, all the equipment that you need to consider also needs to be conforming. So for example, we've got the tripod and winch there. Lola will play a part in making sure that they are effectively inspected. We've got COSH, that is kind of associated with respiratory protective equipment associated with hazardous substances. So again, any maintenance and servicing schedule needs to be in compliance with these other pieces of regulations, and proof that those have been done need to be available. which then leads us on to rescue arrangements. Okay. Regulation 5 of the confined space regs. Okay. We could argue here at Mines Rescue that this set of regulations is what has based our innovation, if you like, to become what we have become. This was almost our starting point, if you like. Okay. Regulation 5 basically states that no person at work shall enter or carry out work in a confined space unless there have been prepared in respect of that confined space suitable and sufficient arrangements for the rescue of persons in the event of an emergency, whether or not arising out of a specified risk. Okay. Now there are some key elements that we can take from that. Okay. It doesn't say, so far as reasonably practicable, put a rescue plan in place. It basically says, if somebody has to enter that confined space, then consideration has to be given to how that person is brought back out again. Okay. So this touches a little bit on how confined spaces might be classified, if you like, all right, or categorized. The more high risk a confined space is, the more complex the emergency plan will be, and the more complex and excess that the resources will need to be to make it work. What I mean by that is, if you've got a confined space that is generally deemed a low risk environment, all right, to paint a basic picture of that is that's basically where you're saying that a specified risk has been present in some capacity. There is an element of enclosure. Somebody has to go into it, but the likelihood that that is going to do any significant harm is very low. Then it's generally a low risk environment, right? An emergency plan on the back of that might just simply be a first aider is present. They are aware that the entry is happening. There's a means of communicating with them. And that's it. The catch is, though, that has to be planned before the entry. You can't be running around looking for a first aider who might be doing some other work when it's too late. Okay? It still has to be planned, but it could be very basic. Okay? But if you then start coming into the realms of a medium risk environment or a high risk environment, for the purposes of this conversation, a medium risk environment is where the specified risk has been present, but it is under control. Okay? If that safe system was to fail and that specified risk, whichever one it may be, was then to become a reality, then it's actually very difficult in most cases to justify not having some more thorough resources in place. Things like rescue teams, okay? Or specialist equipment like tripods and winches, and somebody stays permanently attached to be able to get winched out, okay? But in most cases, the more complex the space, the more hazardous the space, the more resources that are needed, okay? A high risk by definition is almost that the specified risk is present and is very difficult to control. And you're almost relying on the last line of defense, PPE. Perfect example of that would be people having to go into a confined space to carry out work while wearing breathing apparatus. You're essentially saying to that person, we can't control the atmosphere in there, so you're going to have to take your fresh air with you, okay? So it's very unlikely, it's not impossible, but it's quite difficult to justify not having some form of rescue availability in that medium to high risk environment, okay? And that might include specialist equipment, specially trained people, specialist contractors to come in and carry out that work for you, okay? It also states whether or not arising out of a specified risk. Now, this often catches managers or supervisors by surprise here a little bit. What that basically means is it actually doesn't matter why that person who's in the confined space can't get himself back out again. Okay, obviously your headline acts are the fact that he's maybe suffocating because the control measure has failed and that toxic fume is now poisoning them, or the oxygen content in the air is dropping, or it's caught fire. All right, those are your headline acts, if you like. But your rescue plan also has to consider the fact that the guy might have sprained his ankle and couldn't climb back up the ladder. Mother Nature might have just decided that fate has dealt this person a bad hand and they're having a heart attack in that space. And given that situation, if you think about this from almost a novelty point of view, if you like, do you think it's acceptable that there's an emergency situation, person can't get out of the confined space, somebody in charge says, why can't they get out? And you say, oh, he's having a heart attack. The response to that shouldn't be, oh, it's got nothing to do with the confined space. Shut the lid, we'll get them later. It doesn't matter. If there is an emergency situation, regardless of what is causing it, the emergency plan has to be suitable and sufficient for that. Okay? Some key points from that would be that a resuscitation equipment where the risk assessment has identified a potential need. So let's look at that in practical terms. CPR at a basic level, if we take the pandemic situation out of the equation, requires somebody to give somebody rescue breaths and compress the chest. But if you're in a hostile environment and your rescuers are wearing breathing apparatus, who is delivering the rescue breaths? Also, if you're just compressing the chest, all that might mean is you're drawing in that hostile atmosphere into their nasal passages, okay? So respiratory or resuscitation equipment is a piece of equipment that essentially creates a barrier between the casualty and a hostile environment and also forces oxygen into their system. But want of a better term, it essentially breathes for the casualty. Okay, so if you have identified on your risk assessment that a hostile or toxic or oxygen deficient atmosphere is present or could be present, then your rescue plan has to consider that and the specialist equipment that might be required. You have to ensure the safety of the person who has been appointed to raise the alarm. What would be the point in having somebody like a safety guardian in place, but they have also become overcome or affected by the hazard that has caused the emergency in the space and are potentially unable to raise the alarm? Okay, you need to be able to look after the people, whether it's rescuers or the person who's going to raise the alarm, your safety attendant or guardian, to make sure that they are essentially part of the solution to this problem as opposed to part of the problem. And ultimately, the plan must be implemented immediately if an emergency arises. Okay, that's essentially, what that means is you've not really got a plan if you haven't been able to plan whether it works or not. So an effective, suitable and sufficient plan means that everybody knows the rules, everybody knows what to do. So should that, hopefully unlikely, but should that emergency situation arise, everybody knows what they're doing. And hopefully that creates more positive outcomes than negative ones. So, as we said earlier on, it does not stipulate so far as reasonably practicable. Having an emergency plan is a must. If the confined space regulations apply, then Regulation 5 of them are applicable, so you must have one. This is also a common point, okay? It must be on-site arrangements. How the approved code of practice for Regulation 5, how it kind of dictates it, if you like. It says solely relying on the public emergency services will not be deemed suitable and sufficient for compliance with the confined space regulations. Now, there is a number of reasons why that's the case, right? And I'll give you a couple of the headline ones if you like, okay? The human body can only function for around about 3 to 4 minutes if the respiratory system isn't working correctly. Combination of the lack of oxygen and a buildup of the carbon dioxide inside the body basically means after 3 to 4 minutes, brain damage can become irreversible, okay? That basically means that that person who was exposed to that is not coming out of that environment with the same standard of living they had beforehand, okay? Irreversible brain damage. Now, if you put that into kind of practical terms, if your so-called plan was to phone 999, the emergency services after 3 to 4 minutes are not ready to facilitate that rescue operation. For want of a better term, the fire services are probably hanging up the phone and sliding down the pole to get to the fire engine, okay? Then if you consider the travel time, the fact that it's the public is their priority, and given the fact that chances are being a firefighter is a hard enough job as it is. If they had to be jacks of all trades and have an understanding of the hazards and risks involved in many high hazard industries, basically your average shift firefighter doesn't know the hazards associated with distilling whiskey, doesn't know the hazards associated with cleaning water, doesn't know the hazards associated with making concrete. The firefighters. So chances are, do you think that they have the competencies to necessarily facilitate a safe rescue without putting themselves at risk in these high hazards environments? The answer to that is no. If your plan was to rely on the public emergency services, then you don't have a plan, okay? You are swinging blind and hoping for the best, okay? You also need to consider, as we said earlier on, safeguarding the rescuers. These guys need to be trained, they need to have the correct equipment, they need to have the correct procedures, and it needs to be a documented process. To look at this from an extreme standpoint, every single confined space has the potential to be different, all depending on the access points, the hazards inside it, and the varying countless amounts of different tasks that might have to happen in it. Every confined space and the work that gets carried out in it needs to be considered upon its own merits. And there are certain elements of training, certain types of equipment that will vary depending on those hazards, risks, and environments that people are having to work in. So it's very important that not only are your confined space rescuers trained and competent, but ultimately they are a part of a solution to a problem that has just occurred, not part of the problem itself. And if you've got, for example, let's just say the first hazard on a risk assessment was explosive atmosphere, and you had a rescue team that was located with all their equipment right at the entry point to that confined space. Now, in some situations, that's the best place for them to be to get a quick response. But if your main hazard on that risk assessment was an explosive atmosphere, and that comes into fruition and becomes a reality, then chances are your confined space plus your rescue team, safety guardian, and all their equipment are now lying in bits somewhere. So again, if you apply all this to a safe system of work and a planned emergency procedure, then things like that need to be considered. You might have your rescue team in radio communication, but located at a safe distance where, should some of those main hazards be realized, they can actually be a solution to that problem by being able to facilitate a response as opposed to being part of your problem. So safeguarding the rescuers is essential. Any questions?
Well done, Andy. I
Thank
think that was a fantastic presentation. So thank you very much for that. And I suppose more so for people that don't necessarily understand the full implications of working in and around confined spaces. I thought the information you delivered there very clear. So yeah, thanks very much for that. We have got a couple of questions here. Without putting you on the spot, I don't know if you're aware of the Pike River mine disaster from 2010.
Yep.
I don't know how familiar you are with it, but there is a bit of a technical one in here. So for those who don't know what that was, the Pike River mine disaster was where 29 miners lost their lives, and it was due to a methane buildup and an explosion that took place. And sadly, them 29 miners, I think at the time, were about 5,000 feet down at the time, and the bodies were never recovered. I believe more recently so, the rescue had restarted again. I think, was it last year, where they'd managed to recover two of the bodies out of there, and there's talk about potentially going in and trying to recover the rest of them. So the question in itself is, do you know, or do you think that modern technologies or health and safety, or what health and safety measures could have prevented some of the Pike River losses in New Zealand? And if so, how?
Oh, wow. If you were to look at the report from Pike River, if you were to give it a good read, right, and you were to compare it to probably one of the big headline acts for industrial disasters here in the UK, Piper Alpha, there's a much to a muchness of it, right? Piper Alpha kind of dictated failing after failing after failing after failing, which led to that eventful night, if you like. It wasn't just one mistake by one person. It was a series of, as I mentioned earlier on, they probably didn't have a good culture for safety, all right? If you read the Pike River report, they read the same. It wasn't just, methane is released naturally when you cut the coal. So it's almost like public enemy number one for miners, all right? So it's a hazard that has to be considered when you're doing mining operations for coal. But if you read the report, it kind of suggests that in the build up to it, high levels of methane were constantly being recorded. Management structures and hierarchies were, let's just say, putting coal production and profit almost above safety, very similar to what we were reading about Piper Alpha. So whether we want to refer to it as new technologies and systems, that's some things that could help, but ultimately some of the very principles of basic health and safety management, taking things seriously. I mean, even things like, I'm not saying they didn't have it, but even some formal process, like for example, near miss reporting, that almost adds a stamp of, formality to things that potentially could have gone wrong but didn't. Had somebody been able to formalize their complaints about the high levels of methane in the days and weeks building up to the disaster, then ultimately that might have led to some form of prevention getting put in place where people weren't able to just sweep it under the carpet. So sure, there's more modern means of ventilating mines, there's more cleaner methods for being able to cut coal and things like that, but ultimately you're up against Mother Nature there with the methane being released from the coal. So some of the better systems in place that could have prevented that are things that we might potentially start to take more for granted here in the UK, and just have better management structures and better cultures for safety in the first place. And that would have gone a long way. As I said, if you read the reports to Pike River, and anybody who has a good understanding of health and safety procedures, quite a lot of the time when you're reading it, you're having a nervous laugh and your head's in your hand because you're thinking, how did it even get that far in the first place? And, we talk about barriers to safety and pressure from above, management saying, make money, make money, make money. Safety can come later, then it could easily have been prevented.
Yeah. I think you touched on some good points there, particularly, and I think it was highlighted, well, in fact, there was numerous safety reports that were made at the time. People making these observations, if you like, and nothing was ever done about it. And ultimately, I think it was down to the inadequate ventilation, the poor design of the mine, the lack of overall management, I think.
I don't think I'm necessarily out of place when I say this, but Mines Rescue Service in the UK was invited onto a panel for Pike River, and we actually sent a couple of representatives over to New Zealand to be part of the discussion on how they're actually going to bring these deceased miners out. But when they actually came up with their plan on how they were going to do it, they actually borderline did the opposite to what the UK Mines Rescue Service had suggested. This is how we would do it.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually basically says, if you're not going to take our advice, then do what you want to do, but we're not going to be party to your decision, if you like. And I think there was a bit of a general consensus, if you like, that so much time had passed that they were actually causing more distress to the families having to put them through it again, rather than just decide like it's done. And and ultimately you gave people hope that all 29 miners could be brought out, but ultimately their plan, we could argue, failed because they were only able to bring out 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
Giving people hope based on a system that ultimately didn't work, and we could argue that's worse. So
no, good. Thanks for that response, Andy. There is another question here. Do you think there's any particular industries who either lead the way in managing confined spaces, or have you come across some industries where maybe the standards need to improve?
I think in Scotland, our water industry, our Scottish Water, on paper, they've got lots of excellent processes in place. They're very good at competence, management structures, risk assessment processes, and things like that. If I was to compare that to another big industry that I think could do better, I would say oil and gas. Oil and gas, particularly because of offshore environments and a lot of micromanagement, if you like, think that because they're by themselves on a 100 square foot platform, that they can get away with doing things that they shouldn't really be doing, if you like. And I think that that's a particular industry that has a lot of lessons to be learned. So the water industry are pretty good at. Oil and gas could do better.
And that surprises me, just being such a huge organization that they are, or or huge industry that they are worldwide. The amount of revenue that comes through, you'd have thought that the safety standards over there would have been.
They're not as bad as they once were, but I'm certainly not going to name any names here.
No.
Some organizations, they give entrance or potential entrance into confined spaces. It's almost like part of a site induction.
Mm-hmm.
This is a confined space, and this is what an escape set looks like. That's nowhere near enough training to get a competence level that actually allows people to understand how to put those escape sets on their face, or what information a gas monitor is actually telling them when it alarms. So although they've got better, I think they do still have some hoops to jump through to be better or be safe.
Sure. Okay. There's a couple more that's just come in. So this one from Alexander. Alexander works in the telecoms industry, who has contractors accessing various chambers. He's working in there as a health and safety manager for the clients, and is wondering if he requires any specific training on confined spaces to be deemed competent to manage these contractors under the CDM regs.
That's a fairly common question, right? And what you need to take from it is legislation doesn't say trained and competent. It says competent. And competence, as we said, is that measure of skill, knowledge, attitude, training, and experience. Okay. And what that looks like for lots of different hazards and tasks, it's all relevant based on it. Some people need more skill, some people need more knowledge, some people need just better attitudes and things like that, all right? Cost-confined space work, if you were to dive, if you're to do a deep dive into it, there's a lot of potential complexities in there, all right? So if you wanted a straight up answer, black and white, from a legal standpoint, if your employer deems you competent to be able to do that, if you've got competence in writing risk assessments, competence in creating safe methods and that type of stuff, then as long as you're deemed competent and whatever that looks like, then as long as that competency can be verified in some way, then you're in compliance with the law, all right? What we would argue, and this is coming from a business sense, if you like, that because there are a lot of complexities potentially associated with confined space work, the reason why managing confined space courses exist is, just as a basic example, just because you can write a manual handling risk assessment doesn't necessarily mean that you can write a confined space risk assessment. Just because you can, risk assess tasks that you're knowledgeable in doesn't necessarily mean that you can write a COSH assessment. So training exists to reinforce those competencies. So from a training provider's standpoint, we would say that for confined space work, it would be to your benefit to have that deep dive if you're doing it on a regular basis, all right? If you're dealing with relatively low risk environments, then potentially not so much. But a nice way to reinforce competence is essentially to have a certificate that says that you have attended a training course that has a focus on those particular subjects. So it's not essential, but we could argue it's good practice.
Okay, that kind of leads me into another question. I mean, obviously, there's different levels of training for I suppose confined space entry for the low, medium, and high risk. Can you just give a brief overview of the differences between them?
Okay, so all of our training courses that we produce here are based on the National Occupational Standards for Confined Spaces. Okay, if you were to go to the NOS website and write confined spaces into the search engine, you'll find them. All right. To put what a national occupational standard is into practical terms is essentially a job profile. And what it lists down one side is what people who work in these environments or particular tasks should know. They're called the K sections, and it stipulates what they should be able to do is the P section, practical basically, all right? So all of our training courses are based around these job profiles produced by the National Occupational Standards, which are produced by industry experts, that type of stuff, right? So to define them, if you like, a low risk confined space are spaces that specified risk is known, but unlikely to do any severe damage, for want of a better term. They are generally easy to access. How it's worded is entrants can get themselves in and get themselves out. So there's no need for specialist equipment like tripods, winches, harnesses, and that type of stuff. Okay. A medium risk confined space is where a specified risk is known but controlled. Okay. Some defining features of a medium risk confined space is that they're not straightforward to access. They might need additional equipment like tripods, winches, and harnesses. Okay. But also a common feature of those is the use of escape breathing apparatus. And generally, it's almost like the defining piece of equipment with medium risk confined spaces is that toxic or hostile environment is people take the escape sets with them that should the gas monitor alarm or that safe system fail, that provides them with essentially a parachute to be able to don the escape set. It gives them a quick supply of fresh air to get them out to a place of safety, all right? So specified risk is known, but under control, but measures have been put in place to safeguard the people who are working in it. High risk confined space, by definition, is the specified risk is known and it's present. Okay, and I think I gave the example earlier on where if you've got a hostile environment and people actually have to do the work in breathing apparatus. So if somebody was to come on a high risk confined space course here, the bulk of that course is training them how to use open circuit breathing apparatus. How it feels on their face, climbing ladders, crawling about, that type of stuff with that breathing apparatus on their face. I mean, if you think about the hierarchy of control, okay, if you're looking at a risk assessment, and I picked up a risk assessment and I saw breathing apparatus as one of the first control measure, it's actually a red flag for me, right? It's a red flag for one of two reasons. One is it might be a really good risk assessment, but what the risk assessor is telling me is it's dangerous in there. I can't control the atmosphere, so you're going to have to take fresh air with you, right? Or the other red flag is that it's a terrible risk assessment. Nobody's applied the hierarchy of control to it, and they've gone straight to, oh, there's a hostile environment in there, let's just put breathing apparatus on, and gave no consideration to how they eliminate it or control it or isolate it or anything like that. So essentially what makes a high risk confined space is that the specified risk is known and is present. And we're relying on those lower ends of the hierarchy of control to protect the people who are working in it. Cool.
So Alexander's just come back. He said, fantastic. Thanks very much for, I think you've answered his question there. He's saying his thoughts as well, I think. So appreciate that. I've got 2 or 3 more questions, if that's all right, Andy, if you've got the time.
Well, of course I do. Fire away.
Yep, no problem. So we've got one here from Andrew. So Andrew's read recently that's about someone that's died from carbon monoxide poisoning from a transformer that had run dry of oil. So in your opinion, would you say the main problem with confined spaces is people not realizing that it is one?
I would certainly say that was a big one, yes. If you think back to one of the first slides about accidents where it kind of stipulated that around about half of the fatalities are would-be rescuers, what that suggests is that's a lack of knowledge of the hazards and risks that are present in that space. So the short answer to that is that aye.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a question here from Grant. So Grant is a safety consultant and he's a business owner as well. He's got a number of clients who work in the asbestos removal industry, and many of them don't have adequate controls and emergency arrangements in place for stripping asbestos within floor ducts or service ducts. So my question, or Grant's question is, do Mines Rescue provide a rescue cover, I presume a rescue service, for entering a live asbestos removal enclosure to provide an emergency response? And the second part to that is, have Mines Rescue ever come across this sort of instance previous, specifically related to an asbestos enclosure deemed a confined space?
In terms of being able to provide a rescue service for asbestos, yes, we could provide emergency arrangements for that, but it's not, because asbestos is controlled under the prohibition and control of asbestos regulations. That's why it's not a specified risk. It's not really mentioned in the confined space regs, and that's essentially our bread and butter, if you like. But we actually have done rescue cover for, I mean, they're few and far between, but we have done it in the past. And the only thing that we would add to that is we've done it in the past. We've done it for an organization, and we had to go and send our guys for some additional training, asbestos awareness and asbestos management training, like a couple of days worth of training, just to be able to understand some of the more specific controls about asbestos, things like decontamination areas and things like that, and how to remove their dirty, exposed, their suits and that type of stuff, and how they then bring that leave that there and enter the safe environments through the kind of, you know, the air zones and things like that. So yes, it is a service that we can provide, but at the same time, there's some additional hoops that we would have to jump through because it's so far and few and far between. Some of the competencies associated with asbestos, we don't maintain as regularly as we would with other competencies because it doesn't often happen, but it has happened in the past.
So working in and around, I suppose, an enclosed environment that does have asbestos isn't necessarily deemed a confined space.
No.
No.
One of the things that you have to think about from a legal standpoint, right? Forget about things in practice, but let's talk about the legal definitions of things, right? If I was to use the term enclosed space, but also in the same kind of discussion or the same sentence, I use the term confined space, all right? If you look confined and enclosed up in the dictionary, they have very similar meanings. So people might think I'm just using a different terminology to describe the same place, right? But from a legal standpoint, there are set definitions between a confined space and an enclosed space, all right? Basically, an enclosed space doesn't have that side of the triangle that says specified risk. And using the example of asbestos, asbestos is not a specified risk under the confined space regulations. Okay, so what we're dealing with there is a high hazard enclosed space, right? So the confined space regulations don't apply, all right, because we've not got that specified risk side of the triangle, okay? But just because the confined space regulations don't apply, the Health and Safety at Work Act always does, right? And it's not uncommon, and I'm thinking about the bigger picture here, not just talking about asbestos, but some organizations that do have a very positive culture for safety, they will treat very high hazard or awkward enclosed spaces with the same precautions that they would if it was a confined space. So that's why potentially we've done some work with some organizations in the past, because asbestos is a high hazard. And if you're doing that kind of removal in an enclosed environment, they've thought to themselves, well, look, if there's an emergency situation in there, and given the nature of the hazard, the asbestos in this conversation, we might need some specialist arrangements to go and rescue people from that environment. So we'll bring in a rescue team just as if we would if it was not asbestos, but it was because of a carbon monoxide or methane, for example, or any other one of those specified risks. So it's ultimately all down to people's risk assessment and safe system that they put in place. And although asbestos as a specific one has been quite rare, we have produced or done rescue cover for what we would class as being high hazard enclosed spaces.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Andy. And Grant, I hope that answers your question as well. One final one just to wrap things up. And again, this is to do with another incident that took place. And again, I'm not sure if you're familiar or not, but it was a lady called Alison Hume who fell down a mine shaft in Galston in 2008.
Yeah.
Could that have been prevented in any way? I think there is a short answer to this. I'll let you answer it.
Okay. How that incident began, there's no way to control somebody taking a shortcut across a field and falling down a hole, especially if nobody is aware that that hole is now dangerous. All right. We do some work with the Coal Authority. In fact, it's my duty week this week, where we are on what we call surface hazard call, if you like, right? And if we get that call because somebody has identified that a potential shaft has opened up, and as we're coming into the winter months and heavy rainfall, this is shaft season, as we call it, right? But if nobody knows that that hole is there to report it to the Coal Authority, then it's very difficult to say we could have prevented it. I think the situation with Alison was she was out with some friends. She took a shortcut across some field and ultimately couldn't see it because it was quite dark at night and fell down. All right. So in terms of that element of it, very difficult to control. All right. But in terms of what could have happened to prevent her fatality, then there are lots of things that could have been done better. And this is always the issue with these tragedies, if you like, that on reflection or in hindsight, everybody has great ideas after it's happened. And if you put all that together, then yes, there are things that could have been done better. Like if you use the situation we were talking earlier on about relying on the public emergency services. In that particular incident, it became relevant that, and just be mindful of my choice of words here, right? I'm not saying the fire service were incompetent, okay? Far from it. But what I'm saying is that the fire service on that particular occasion potentially lacked some of the competencies required to safely retrieve somebody from a mine shaft, all right? And as they were figuring out almost dynamically the best way to rescue Alison, unfortunately, her death wasn't so much, her injuries were not so much related to falling down a hole. What ultimately resulted in her passing away was the length of time she was left in the hole. I mean, I think her cause of death was a combination of cardiac arrest, shock, and hypothermia, which is more associated with injuries being left untreated as opposed to, you know, she fell down the hole and fractured her skull. Okay. So in hindsight, yes, there are lots of things that could have been done better. What that looked like, who knows? I do know that the fire service certainly learned lessons from it and have put in places, like, for example, they come here, they do training with us. They've done, you know, tunneling shoring, a combination of the Stockline disaster in Glasgow, also prompted them to improve their competencies, if you like. But if you look at it from see if we were the Mines Rescue Service as what we were 30 years ago, and we had teams of guys here waiting to respond to a mining disaster, okay? If that's what we still were, then we would have had resources available, and had we been given the call, we could have responded and helped them out, okay? But we're a commercial business now, all right? And Crossgate's site here, we've got training courses happening, we've got industrial rescue, so we've got rescue teams dotted all over the place. And if we receive that call, Mines Rescue, we've got a moral obligation to respond. We've got competencies and we've got skill sets that could have helped the fire brigade. But ultimately, we might have not have had the resources available on that day to provide that. I mean, just to give you an example, I've got a rescue team right now at Faz Lane, which is 2 hours away. I've got a rescue team in Peterhead, which is 3 hours away. So because of the nature of our business now, we would do best endeavours to give those public emergency services the support they need. But what that looks like can vary on a day-to-day basis. So it's very difficult to pinpoint what could have been done better.
Sure. Fantastic. Listen, I've just got one more question that's just stuck in there. You're lucky. John, I hope that answered your question. Scott, I'm picking your one up because it is, I think this is quite relevant. So Scott works for a company that deals with outdoor open top wastewater tanks. So when people are going in there, these are drains and the valves are isolated before the guys enter. Would this still be classed as a specified risk? He's always thought that quite possibly it should be, i.e. if someone broke the leg whilst inside the tank and the valve isolation fails, is there a possibility of them drowning because it was reasonably foreseeable?
If you were to look at the confined space regulations, they've actually fairly recently put in a nice little flow diagram with lots of yes and no's, follow the arrows, okay? And also, if you were to have a read through the approved code of practice, it does actually make some pretty clear statements, all right? In that situation that was just described there, okay, all you've done is control the specified risk. You've not eliminated it, okay? From a purely simplistic approach, you've got a water tank, and let's just say there is a valve that is open to put the dirty water into the tank, all right? All you've done is isolated that valve, whether it's mechanical or whatever, right? Shut the valve off and pump the water out, or got rid of the dirty water, all right? As far as the confined space regulations are concerned, all you've done is controlled that specified risk, so the confined space regulations still apply. You've applied a safe system to work to it and made it as safe as it possibly can be, all right? What the approved code of practice also stipulates, though, is you need to be able to prove complete elimination of the specified risk before you could deem it not to be a confined space, okay? And if I was to put that into kind of practical terms, let's just say your water tank that you're dealing with is part of a big system for cleaning it, all right? And the only way that you can prove complete elimination of that hazard is to shut the whole plant down, all right? I'll give you another extreme but relevant example, not too far away from where I'm sat right now. A big oil and gas company have a big liquid petroleum gas plant, all right? And let's just say on a day-to-day basis, that makes around about 3 million quid's worth of liquid petroleum gas, all right? But also on that day, let's just say somewhere amongst that tanks, vessels and pipe work, insurance inspector has to go in and do an inspection on one of the tanks, all right? And it's literally going to take that guy 20 minutes to do that inspection, right? If you weigh up, if you've seen before, the kind of setting scales that talk about how reasonably practicable something is, right? The only way that that company can prove complete elimination of that specified risk is to shut that plant down at a cost of 3 million quid a day for a 20-minute inspection. Now we've got a case where risk is maybe really light, but the cost of doing it is really heavy. So there's no balance there, right? So they're not going to do it, okay? What they're going to do instead is apply a safe system of work associated with that tank. In other words, they're going to control it. They're going to isolate it at either end, ventilate it, gas test it, have competent staff that are going to go and do it. Because the hazard hasn't been proven to be completely eliminated, it has just been controlled under a safe system of work, then confined space regulations will still apply. Hopefully that makes sense.
Perfect sense to me. So Scott, I would suggest that your question there, I mean, if you're suggesting it is still a confined space, you are 100% correct. And I would keep on saying that to people who are ever challenging that. So appreciate it. Well, listen, we've gone on for probably a little bit longer than anticipated, but listen, I find this fascinating, working in confined space. I work in construction anyway, so part of this is my bread and butter anyway. And literally we've just spoken about this for, an hour and a half, and we haven't even really scratched the surface of all the different aspects you could potentially look into with confined space. So on that note, listen, I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. I'd like to thank you, Andy, for stepping in last minute. You've done an absolutely fantastic job, and very clearly you can see your knowledge and your experience. And I just want to thank you for coming along and just sharing this with everybody who's attended tonight. And again, I hope it was of benefit to everybody. So thank you very much for attending. On that note, thank you very much, and we'll draw it to a close.